Hey guys, this is Ben, and what we're going to do in this video is look at Genesis 1 as how it's actually evidence that the Bible is true. It doesn't prove it beyond the shadow of a doubt, but what it does is make predictions that are later confirmed by science. In other words, it says things about the world that no one else was saying at the time that are remarkable. It's remarkably unlikely that they would just predicted these things by accident, and it correctly makes predictions. So Genesis 1 starts out with, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." Now that is important because no other ancient historical creation story had the idea that there was a beginning to time. Genesis did. And that's traditionally how that was always interpreted, that it's the beginning of time itself. Paul in, it's either 1st or 2nd Timothy, he says that God chose us before the beginning of time. So Genesis correctly predicted that because now science has come back and said, hey, it looks like the universe and time itself has a birthday, a starting point, I think 13.7 billion years ago, or roughly 14 billion years ago. And it says, "Now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." So yeah, formless and empty like waters. Well, essentially our entire solar system would have started out as just a huge cloud in space of water and rock and metals and you name it. Just a big fluid mass floating in space, basically in the darkness. And then it says, "And God said, let there be light, and there was light." Yes, that's a correct prediction of the next event. Like that would have happened next. So it puts a list of events here in Genesis 1, and it puts them in a correct order. So it says, "Let there be light." So in the center, the biggest thing that happened in the most of the mass of this cloud in space that eventually became the solar system of all of our planets and the sun, in the center of that, gravity would have pulled different things together, and well, all of it would have just pulled towards itself, towards the center, because gravity attracts one thing to another. And eventually that would have drawn enough matter to the center of the cloud that it would have caused the sun to start happening. So in other words, the first thing that would happen would be that there was light. But this light would have, well, let's just go on. It says God saw that the light was good, and then it says the next thing it says, "And he separated the light from the darkness." So that's actually accurate. The next thing that would have happened, the earth would have been just part of the big cloud around the sun. And so the light and the dark would have just kind of been intermingled, and one would have just faded into another. But eventually, on the earth, a separation between light and dark would happen when enough of the matter that would eventually form the earth, again, it's like gases, it's rocks, it's minerals, it's liquids, it's everything. It would have come together and smushed together and become solid enough in its early stages. And understand, everything would have been all mixed up and just drawn together, but it would have eventually gotten to be solid enough so there was a light side and a dark side, and so and it would start rotating. And so the separation between light and dark on the earth, that's what would have happened next. It says God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Yes, the day-night cycle would have begun. And it says, "And there was evening, and there was morning the first day." Now, the word that's translated day there is a Hebrew word that you can literally translate as afternoon, or you can literally translate as just a period of time. And that would actually be a literal translation. So day, eon, epoch, age, any of those are literal translations. So it's kind of up in the air for how long this period of time was. Now also you have the term "and there was evening and there was morning" there. And that's interesting. The terms evening and morning are also confusing terms in English. So when we say morning, we mean when the sun comes up. But when in ancient Hebrew, that's the language of this, when they said morning, they meant when the sun comes up and you begin working. And so the word in ancient Hebrew, as my research shows, as best as I can understand, it means both of those things. It never means just one of those things. And so Moses is perhaps one of our most interesting interpreters on this. In Psalm 90, you have Moses. First of all, he says that 1,000 years in Psalm 90, and it's likely that Moses wrote Genesis 1, that 1,000 years to the Lord is like a day, or even even a watch in the night, which would be like 4 hours. And he makes it clear that, you know, the concept of time would be different for God, from God's perspective, and that he's willing to use the word day more loosely there. And then he makes it clear that he's willing to use the words evening and morning more loosely. So even if Moses didn't write Genesis, you've got someone in, you know, roughly 1300 BC who's willing to interpret the terms evening and morning. So you go to Psalm 90, the following verse, the verse I just quoted was Psalm 90 verse 4. The next verse is 5 and 6. And in verses 5 and 6, Moses says that a man is like grass that grows up in the morning, but in the evening it is cut down. And he's talking about your life. And of course, evening and morning there are just meaning like beginning of something and ending of something. And he uses it very clearly that way. And of course, grass doesn't just grow up in the morning and get cut down in the evening. It takes multiple days for grass to grow. And then of course, he's using that as a reference to human life, which of course also takes multiple days. So Moses makes it clear that he's willing to do that. And even how you say, I guess early Christian interpreters for the first like 300 years of the early church, they actually were different people, wrote different things about their interpretation of how long these days were. And some people took a 24-hour view. Other people, like for example Cyprian, he took a view that says where Peter in 2 Peter it says a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and so he took that to mean that okay, these days are 1,000 years, and so he said the earth was created in 7,000 years or 6,000 years instead of, you know, whereas what we'll get to later is the arguments from a guy called Origen, and then they were later built on by a later guy called Augustine, who Origen lived at about 200 AD and Augustine lived about 350 AD. And their argument was that God doesn't create the sun and the moon and the stars, or more accurately, they're not in their place doing their normal job until day 4. And so, and we'll get to that. I know you think like that's way out of order, but we'll get to that. It's not really. But the point is without them doing what they normally do, then the days before that, those first 3 days, can't be thought of like our normal days. Which means those first evenings and mornings can't be thought of like our normal evenings and mornings. Which is exactly what Moses said in Psalm 90. That these aren't normal evenings and mornings. And it's important to understand that in the Hebrew, the word evening always meant sun goes down, and it meant quitting work. But this would be a different type of evening, not the normal evening. And of course, one of the biggest issues with, you know, saying that these are 24-hour days is, of course, the biggest hole with that idea is that the 7th day is the day when God stops his work of creating the world. And since God doesn't start back creating the world on day 8, then we must still be in day 7, because certainly it's been 24 hours since the creation of the world. We've got all of human history since the creation of the world. So that means that 7th day is still going. In fact, it's the Sabbath of God, you know, and God blessed it and called it holy, because on it he rested, not began resting, you know, and then kept going, but like it's the Sabbath rest is still going. And in fact, if you look at Genesis 2:4, it refers to all of these, Genesis chapter 2 verse 4, it refers to this entire set of days as one day. Although all the translations, sometimes they hide that from you in the translations, so you got to check multiple translations. But anyway, so yeah, that's not really an issue. It's very traditional. I mean, Moses, Augustine, Origen, like, if you're interpreting this the same way Moses did and the same way St. Augustine did, I think you're on safe ground that like say that these days are not like our normal days. These evenings and mornings are not like our evenings and mornings, especially since the sun and the moon aren't doing their normal job. So anyway, it says that, let's get to the next thing. It says, all right, verse 9, and God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. Well, no, I skipped one. It says, and God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. So it's important. What we have here is, first, there's a separation that happens where the sky is separated from the rest of the planet. And then you have a later separation where dry land pushes up out of the water. So in other words, all of everything that is the earth was all mixed up at first, and gravity pulls the heavier stuff towards the center. So the first things that are going to come out are going to be the gases. And the gases will come out first to the outside and form the sky. Then over time, the heavier rocks will go down and the lighter rocks will get pushed up. And so this is what the scientists tell us, is that originally the earth was covered with water. You can check this out. This is really what the scientists tell us. I can provide links in the description. But that we had an earth that was covered with water and was mostly flat. And as heavier rocks sunk down, lighter rocks came up out, through plate tectonics. Hopefully you know something what I'm talking about. And well, not really plate tectonics. It would have been even more fluid than that. And dry land pushed up out of the oceans. And what's fascinating about this is we are on the halfway point through Genesis's days. And that event, what the scientists tell us, is at the halfway point of Earth's overall history, about 4.4 billion years ago. So that's actually remarkably accurate. That's an accurate prediction that like dry land didn't push up out of the water till about halfway through the Earth's history. Whoa, like Genesis predicted that. Okay, all right. So then it says, let the land produce vegetation. So this is interesting. What Genesis is doing is it's going to we move from the basic formation of the earth. We've got the continents, we've got this stuff, and we move to like evolution or origin of different life forms. And so what we do is it takes a look and it focuses on like the ultimate evolution of this type of life form, and the ultimate evolution of this type of life form, and the ultimate evolution of this type of life form. So what we do is it's going to go through 5 things. It's going to take a look at simple life that like doesn't really move around or is not really looking at things and not really aware. The simple life forms, like bacteria, they're just like oozing and living, you know what I mean? Amoeba and plants. In other words, the next thing that happens is plants emerge and they move to land. And so the interesting thing here is plants are sort of the ultimate evolution of the simple life forms. And so that's what's going to happen next. We're going to, it's not going to cover every detail of the 4.5 billion history of the earth, but it's going to cover the major things, which makes sense. And so the ultimate evolution of simple life forms is, of course, plants. And so it says, then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it according to various kinds. Okay, and so that actually would have happened next. Of course, you don't have plants on land until you have land. And this would have been a major event in Earth's history. Now, some people get upset because they say, trees with fruit trees didn't come till much, much later in Earth's history. That's true, but this is another language problem because the word tree is just a weird word. It's a difficult word to translate. So, like it says later when Abraham put the wood on the altar to sacrifice Isaac, and later in the same book of Genesis, I think chapter 25, it's literally the same word. So you could translate that Abraham put the tree on the altar. And in our mind, in our language, we think he put an entire tree on the altar, which seems kind of like a terrible way to start a fire. Why, Abraham, why wouldn't you cut that up into small pieces of wood? Well, their word for tree and their word for wood, it was the same word. Or like for any hardy, stiff plant that could have branches and could branch out. So in other words, vegetation is a good translation, because that word for them meant like little plant. And then, so the word tree, you could really literally translate that seed-bearing plants and shrubs or trees, or really not shrubs or trees, but shrubs/trees. So this also means shrubs. It's their only word for like a shrub. So like anything that has branches. And in fact, the word fruit can also just mean the branches. In other words, it just means like the fresh stuff that it puts out. It can mean foliage. So in other words, like grass, for example, doesn't really have branches and foliage and put out things like that. But a shrub does. So that's the distinction they're making in the Hebrew language between plants that branch out and have a stiff stalk versus a plant that doesn't. And so they say it's vegetation or tree. But we have lots of more words like shrub and wood and vine and like all these things like that. But they just had like something that would, so that's an issue. That's not really a big issue. But anyway, we keep going. And next it says, and God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night. This is what we're talking about on day 4. Let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. Let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. Okay, so this is the next thing, and this is actually in the correct order. You see, on the early earth, the sun was at 70% of its energy. It later, this is called the faint young sun paradox, if you want to Google this. It's difficult to explain why the earth was covered with water, given that the sun was at 70% energy. So like it should have been all frozen. So what that means is there must have been an incredibly thick layer of greenhouse gases, so thick that like imagine like the cloudiest day ever, so that any light that came in couldn't get back out and the heat couldn't radiate out. So we think like an incredible CO2 layer. Well, what plants do is they take in CO2. And so this is called the snowball Earth, or the Ochlorian epoch. And they think that the Earth was covered with an ice age, and it caused maybe the biggest extinction event in Earth's history. It took about 1 million to 3 million years, or like it was horrible. But all of the CO2 was pulled out of the air by the plants, and then they pumped out ozone and oxygen. And so what that did is it did make it so that there were lights in the sky. There were no lights in the sky. You couldn't see the sun and the moon before that. It was just like a big light time and dark time. So when it says, and God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky, well, that's exactly what happened next. And so that's when he made it so that there were lights in the sky. All right. So, and it would also include stars. Yeah, all of that. Of course it would include stars. If you can't see the sun and the moon, you definitely can't see stars. All right, so anyway, and then it says, and God said, let the water teem with living creatures, so, and let birds fly above the earth. So, the interesting thing here is, the next thing that would have happened is the Cambrian explosion, but that's probably not what this is talking about. Remember, it's focusing, it has a consistent theme of focusing on the ultimate evolution of things. Although, maybe it's referencing the Cambrian explosion when in other words, the Cambrian explosion is when animals first formed. So we moved from simple life forms like plants and bacteria and stuff like that are just like these cells, collections of cells, to like animals, things that like move around and look at stuff and like eat things, you know. All right, so that's the Cambrian explosion in the oceans. And so interesting thing here is like what happened was if it talks about the ultimate evolution of sea life, well, it actually uses a term when it says let the water teem with living creatures, the word living creatures is actually nephesh, which means an animal that has the breath of life in it. So in the Hebrew concept, that meant it had a soul. Just like it says later, God created the man, formed him, and it says he breathed the breath of life into him. So that's the same concept here. And so the animals that breathe air, that live in the water, are of course the ultimate evolution of sea life, which are whales and killer whales and dolphins and all that stuff. That's the ultimate evolution of sea life. They rule the seas. And they only come when you have a sea filled with life. Some of those fish leave the water. Some become amphibians, that are creatures that live some of their life cycle in water and some of their life cycle on land. Eventually that splits off. And somewhere along the line, you get a tree that like goes into dinosaurs, and somewhere along the line, it splits off and becomes mammals. One of these mammal life forms eventually takes back to the sea, and their ability to breathe air makes them more intelligent than the other animals, among other adaptations that they have that just give them advantages. So they become the dominant life form in the oceans. They are the ultimate sea life. Okay. The killer whale is the apex predator. They're more intelligent than anything else in the sea. Okay, so the next thing it says, let birds fly. And so the interesting thing here is it talks about birds. Well, birds are the ultimate evolution of dinosaurs. We think of like, oh, well, the dinosaur age ended. No, it didn't. Dinosaurs are still with us. They just evolved into their ultimate level, because the conditions on the earth changed and they adapted to it. And, but dinosaurs are like birds, right? They made nests. They laid eggs in their nest. They roosted on those eggs like a chicken. And when those eggs hatched, they took care of them. They fed their babies in the nest, their hatchlings. Okay? So, again, we're talking about the ultimate evolution of things. And the next one we get is to the ultimate evolution of land creatures, which are the land mammals we have today. It says the livestock, creatures that move along the ground, which that's their term for rodents. And then the wild animals, that's their term for land carnivores. Okay? And so it's talking about the land carnivores we see today. And again, those came after whales and after birds. Okay, so we've got like people say the age of mammals. Well, that came next. And the ultimate evolution of that is the mammals that we see today. Although they all emerged long before the last one on the list, the ultimate evolution of all life. So we're going to bring this ultimate evolution of life thing full circle. The last one, which 100,000 years ago, not that long ago, modern humans emerge on the earth, and they're created in God's image. So because Genesis made all of these predictions, this becomes evidence that Genesis is true. Now let me be the first to say that there are things that Genesis says about the early earth and the origin of humans in the next chapter that science tells us is way wrong. So keep that in mind, but you need to recognize and take seriously the fact that Genesis did make a remarkable set of predictions that are remarkably accurate, bang, 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 in this chapter, especially given that for about 300 years, science said there's no way the universe has a birthday, that matter can't be created or destroyed until Big Bang Theory came along and just blew it up. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for your time.